Ben, making these hot dogs over the fire with you just reminds me of that parable Jesus tells us about. And he says if we have faith like a mustard...
Wait, I got this one.
Wait, what? You have what? Oh no, Ben. No. He actually says...
Oh. Look at all this faith!
No, Jesus actually says if we have faith like a mustard seed. Yeah, if we have faith like a mustard seed.
Man, my hot dog.
Oh, buddy. Yeah, that's pretty burnt. Yeah.
You want some?
Oh no, Ben. No.
Hey, good to see you. My name is Brooks, and I get to be one of the pastors here at the church. And we're in this sermon series where we're talking about the parables of Jesus, and each week we're just taking a parable and unpacking it, talking about it. And I imagine that Jesus was around a fire with his disciples and sharing these stories, and that video was gross. All right, it just was. It was gross. Yeah, we're gonna unpack a parable today. But before we get into that, I did something recently that I'm really proud of. I did a marathon recently. Yeah. Well, it was a movie marathon, but one of these things, what I did for this, where I watched the Lord of the Rings trilogy with my kids, and to get prepared for this movie marathon, we watched other movies, all right, in preparation. And one of the movies that I recently watched for the first time with my kids was this movie called Les Miserables. It's from an old play, and there's a lot of different versions of Les Miserables. I personally think the Liam Neeson version is the best version of Les Miserables. You can disagree with me, we can still be friends, but you'll still be wrong, okay? So the Liam Neeson version is the best. But if you're not familiar with Les Mis, you gotta get familiar with it. It's this beautiful story of redemption, forgiveness, grace. But one of the beginning scenes is the most powerful and potent of the scenes. It's Jean Valjean. He's been in prison for years and years and years, and he gets released, and he gets taken in. He's offered hospitality by this Catholic priest. The priest brings him into his house, and Jean Valjean gets up in the middle of the night and steals things from the house and takes off and leaves. And he gets apprehended, and he's brought back to the house. And there's this moment where he's brought back in handcuffs, and the priest says, no, let him out of those handcuffs. I gave him those things. And it's this interaction that Jean Valjean has with this priest where the priest says, remember this moment. I'm buying back your soul. This forgiveness, this grace that I'm offering you will change everything. And you know what? It does. His life is completely changed because of the forgiveness that he receives in that moment. We're going to talk about forgiveness today. I've been a pastor for about 20 years, and this is the thing that I talk about most with people over a cup of coffee. This is the thing I talk about most when I'm doing marriage counseling, when I'm sitting with a couple and we're just talking about just how to do this. This is what I talk about most and work through in my own heart, in my own marriage. This is the thing that when we turn on the news and we see all sorts of things that are happening all across the globe, and I'm like you, there's times where I've sat back and said, man, if only we could just forgive. I mean, wouldn't things just get so much better? This is the thing that, man, if we could figure this out, it would absolutely transform our planet. And you probably know this already, but this is at the center of Christianity. This is at the crux. It's like as if we understood this, then we could understand the whole story. But here's the other thing about forgiveness that I know that you know. It's this. Forgiveness is one of the most complicated things we do as humans. Isn't it? It's complicated. It is not easy. It is not cut and dry. Things have been taught about forgiveness. There's things that we believe about forgiveness that are wrong and skewed. We'll get into that in just a few minutes. But here's one of the reasons why forgiveness is complicated. The reason is because unforgiveness is hard to see. Unforgiveness and the bitterness and the anger that stems from it is hard to see and diagnose, isn't it? It's hard to see. It's like One of my favorite places in the Bible that brings our attention to this is from the book of Hebrews. This is what the author of Hebrews says. It says, "See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many become defiled." I love this word picture right here. This is so helpful. Root of bitterness. That this bitterness, this unforgiveness that is described as a root. Now, we all know how roots work, right? How do roots work? Roots work subterraneously. They work underground. You've tried to teach someone to pull weeds, and what do you tell them? What do you tell anyone you're trying to pull a weed the correct way, right? You always have to get you got to get the root. Because if you just get if you get what's on the top, it could still be alive and growing in there. And this is kind of how unforgiveness and the bitterness and the envy and everything that it works underground, meaning it's just hard to diagnose, it's hard to see. Even just now, when I said, hey, we're going to talk about forgiveness, some of us were like, oh, man, that's not my problem. I'm good there, I'm fine. I know about some other people who should be here today for this sermon. Definitely, I'm thinking through who should be here, but that's not my issue. And if that was your reaction, I would just, for all of us, I would say, slow down, be careful, because how it works is it works underground. It's hard to diagnose. It's hard to see. At Christmas time we have wreaths, right? There's a wreath, and the word origin of wreath is to be twisted around itself, to be twisted back onto itself. That's the wreath. It's the same word origin that we get wrath. Wreath and wrath. Because what is wrath? Wrath is to be twisted in on itself. It's the same word that we get writhe, and it's the same word that we get wraith. Wraith. And what is a wraith? A wraith is a ghost. And what is a ghost? A ghost is something was done to it, and now it has to hover around that same place or that same circumstance, and it can't move on. It has to it's not alive. It can't live, but it's half alive, and it's always living in the past, and it can't move on because it just has to kind of stay in that same place. And it's so tragic that there's so many that are walking around in life. And maybe you walked in today and you're feeling like this perhaps. There's so many that are walking around in life, but they're a ghost. Just a ghost. Because something was done, there's this unforgiveness, there's this bitterness, there's this hurt, there's these wounds from the past, and we're just holding on to them, and we don't know how to move on. We don't know how to move, we don't know how to leave it behind, and so we're just stuck. And it's into this reality that Jesus steps onto the scene. It's into this reality where Jesus comes and he's bringing a new kingdom, a new kind of kingdom. And where he's introducing us to a new way of being human, a new way of understanding how to navigate all of these things. He's inviting us to participate into this new kingdom, and forgiveness is a huge, huge part of it. So we're going to look at this parable. And parables were a kind of teaching device that many rabbis and teachers used in Jesus' day, and so Jesus was no different. He was always with a parable, and it's kind of like this story with a deeper intent. And Jesus is about to share this parable, and I'm so excited to unpack it together. Here's the context. This is Matthew 18, and Jesus just got done talking to the disciples about what you do when someone offends you. And he talks through, hey, when somebody offends you, here's what you do. Here's how you work that out. And then, as oftentimes what happens, Peter pipes up, one of his disciples, and then just takes Jesus on a little rabbit trail, and then out comes this parable. It's from Matthew 18. I'm just going to read it, and then we're just going to unpack a few things. Matthew 18, starting in verse 21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? But Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. And then he dives into this parable. He says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And as he began a settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. And since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. And at this, the servant fell on his knees before him And he said, "Be patient with me," he begged, "and I will pay back everything." The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. And he grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay it back." But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. And when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged, and they went and told their master, that first master, everything that had happened. And then the master called the servant in, and he said, "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" And in anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed. And then it's like Jesus steps out of the parable, and then it's like he's just finished telling the story, and then he looks at his disciples, and this is how he ends, and it's haunting. He says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." It's brilliantly simple, but not easy. It's not just brilliantly simple, it's painfully clear what this parable is about, right? We're supposed to hear this parable, and if your reaction to this parable after hearing it is, "Oh my goodness, that is just wrong for this guy who got forgiven all this debt," it's just wrong for him then to not go and extend that same forgiveness to other people in his life. It's just wrong. And if that's our reaction to the parable, then that means we understand it. It means we get it. It's painfully clear what this parable is about. And apparently for Jesus, forgiveness is a really, really big deal. And apparently, how Jesus sees it, God's forgiveness of me directly impacts and influences my relationships with other people around me. So let's just dive into this parable just a little bit, just a couple details. First, Peter says 7 times. Why does Peter say 7 times? Remember, Peter's like, "Should I forgive 7 times?" And there's all sorts of speculation, different reasons why Peter might have picked 7. And one of the reasons is probably in that day, rabbis taught that 3 times was an appropriate amount of times to forgive someone that hurts you or wrongs you or offends you. 3 times. And so I think probably Peter, he's trying to maybe impress Jesus right now, or maybe he's trying to impress the other disciples around the circle. But Peter takes that number, multiplies it by 2, and adds 1 for good measure. He's like 7. He's feeling very generous about 7. What if I forgive 7 times? Like, that's pretty good. And then Jesus responds in a way that nobody expected, and only the way that Jesus does. He flips it around and he says, "No, not 7 times, 77 times." Or in some translations, it says 70 times 7, which would be 490. But for Jesus, is this a debate about how many times? No. For Jesus, is this a math problem that they're working out right here to track how many times we're forgiving? No. I mean, for Jesus, he's telling a bigger stories. And why does Jesus say 77 times specifically? What's funny and interesting is that he's actually referencing a story from the Hebrew scriptures, from the Old Testament, that they would have known about, but sometimes we don't know about, we forget about. There's one other time in the Bible where the number 7 and 77 are right next to each other, and it's all the way back in Genesis chapter 4. In the very beginning of the Bible. It would have been verses that these people would have been very familiar with. And so when Jesus says, not 7 times, 77 times, it would be like a hyperlink all the way back to Genesis chapter 4, and they would have picked up on something that sometimes we forget about or miss out on. And in Genesis chapter 4, here's the context: is there were these 2 brothers, Cain and Abel, and Cain is jealous of Abel. Cain kind of steps out of his humanity and acts like an animal and just succumbs to his kind of like his animalistic nature. He kills his brother. And then Cain is banished. And then 5 generations later, Cain has now created a city, or a town at first, and it's kind of evolved into a city. And this is a city that you wouldn't want to live in. This is a city you don't want to raise your kids in because it is violent. it is angry, it is aggressive. And we meet a descendant of Cain, and his name is Lamech. We're just told a few things about Lamech from Genesis chapter 4 from these two verses, but here's what we know. He's not a very good guy. And what we know about him is he's kind of a little bit of a poet, because what we're going to read here in a second from Genesis 4 is this is Lamech, who's very proud of himself, and it's like he's composed this little song. It's this little limerick that he sings to his lady friends about how macho he is. I'm Lamech, and I am macho. And here's what he says from Genesis chapter 4. He says, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. And so we're picking up a couple things from this story, right? We apparently there was a young guy who injured Lamech in some way. Maybe they got in a battle and Lamech got cut, or maybe it was like a verbal assault on Lamech. Maybe this young man called Lamech some names and he's like emotionally wounded. Like we don't know. But it's like he gets wounded by this young man. And so what does Lamech do? He says, I'm not going to avenge you 7 times. I'm going to avenge you 77 times. You cut me, I kill you. Why? Because I'm Lamech. That's just kind of the guy I am. And it's so interesting that as Jesus is starting to talk to us about what forgiveness is all about, he brings up this story. And so just stop. Do you see what Jesus is doing here? Jesus is juxtaposing this story of Lamech with this different counter story about forgiveness. That forgiveness is doing something counter to our nature. Because what's in our nature is to be like Lamech. That when I get wounded, here's what I want to do, is I want to wound you back. And I don't want to just wound you back. I want you to really feel it. And so my tendency, my kind of like, my gut kind of instinctual nature is to, you wound me, well, I'm going to wound you back more. And this is what we get into. But forgiveness is trying to tell a different story. In forgiveness, we work counter to our nature. Because we say it's about justice, but really what we want is vengeance. And vengeance has consumed Lamech. And vengeance has consumed our world. And if we're honest, there's things in our hearts that have just become black and ugly, because this becomes our tendency, is to, when we get wounded, is to wound back. Here's a couple things about vengeance that I know that you know. But the first thing we got to know about vengeance is vengeance transforms. It transforms me. It changes me. That when somebody wounds me, there's something in my heart where it gets me hard, I get angry, and I'd like to say that it's about justice, but what I can't see is that it stopped being about justice a long time ago. It becomes now about revenge. It becomes now about vengeance. And my heart is so hard that I get to a place where I don't even want them to apologize. I don't want them to apologize because it feels good to have this power and control over someone. What we do when we walk in the ways of Lamech is we put people in impossible situations where they wronged us, they hurt us, and we don't even want them to apologize. We don't even want them to make it right because I liked the feeling of putting them in a place where I have power and control over them, that I can hold on to this grudge, that I don't have to let it go, and I can kind of have this control and power over the situation. It just turns my heart black and ugly. There's this something in me that, like Lamech, where I want to have the satisfaction of at least a short chokehold. Can we all just admit that we've all been tempted to go there, right? At least one time in your life. I mean, you've wanted to just walk in the ways of Lamech when it comes to just people wounding you. Here's what vengeance does. It transforms us. It turns us into ghosts. It turns us into wraiths. The next thing that vengeance does is it compounds. It compounds. It doesn't just stay in one place. It starts to grow. You know what this is like because you've played a prank on someone before in your life. Maybe not recently, maybe in your youth, and it turned into a prank war. And you guys know how prank wars work. Is you do something to somebody and you like shoot them with a super soaker or whatever, and then what do? Well, then they're going to TP your house. And then they TP your house, and so you say, well, I'm going to put a dead fish in their car. And then do you see where this goes? I mean, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And this is the nature of vengeance. This is what comes naturally to us. As we start walking down the road of Lamech. And it just compounds. And then this third thing is where it gets worst of all, is vengeance spreads. It spreads. Meaning when somebody wounds me or hurts me and I've got this anger and unforgiveness and bitterness towards them, so what I'll tend to do is I'll transpose my anger on them, on all the other people that look like them, on their particular group of people that they're from. And now, instead of just being angry at one person, now I'm angry at a whole group of people, maybe because of their skin color, maybe because of their culture, maybe because of their life stage. And when we start doing this, it's over. Tell me that we don't have a problem with this on planet Earth. Tell me that this ugly story hasn't been played out 7 billion times over and over again. And this is what Jesus is doing. He's juxtaposing this typical story of Lamech. This is how we normally handle it. But Jesus is saying, but not so with you. Jesus is introducing the possibility that we can walk in the ways of Jesus instead of walking in the ways of Lamech. That forgiveness is telling a different story. It's a contrast story to the natural story of retaliation and violence. And if we were to really capture this as Christ followers, then Christ followers could do something unthinkable, something incredible, that this story now becomes a sign of the truthfulness of the gospel in our world. That we become a people that can walk in the ways of Jesus instead of walking in the ways of Lamech, that we know how to forgive. And so here's the question. How do we forgive? I mean, how do we do this? Because this is complicated, right? And we have a lot of options, tons of options on how to do this. So first, is somebody wrongs you or hurts you, you can just cut them off. You just not talk to them. Or you can pretend like it never happened and just let it fester on the inside. No, I'm fine. Or you can just cut off relationship with them and just exclude them from your relationship. Or instead of talking to them, you can talk about all the other people around in the sphere. And you don't call it gossip, we call it being a concerned citizen. That's what we call it. So I'm just warning everyone else about what this person did. Or maybe you go talk to them and they don't apologize. Or maybe you go talk to them and they do apologize, but not enough. Or maybe you go talk to them and they apologize and it's enough, but you're still angry. Or maybe you can't go talk to them about the wounds and the hurts because maybe since then they've passed away. They're gone. They're not even here, so you can't even talk to them. Or maybe they moved away, or maybe relationship is estranged, and so now it's like, what do we do? What do we do? How do we forgive? It's so complicated. This parable kind of gives us a couple of clues. And what I want to zero in on is this master, this original master. Remember this king, and he's the one that was owed that huge debt at the very beginning of the story. There's 4 things that he does that I just think we can learn so much from. Okay, 4 things that he does, and it comes straight from the text. From verse 24, it says that the man was brought to him. That means the man that owed him a huge debt was brought to the master, was brought to the king. So the man was brought to him. That's number 1. And then number 2, the master took pity on him. And then number 3, canceled the debt. And then number 4, he let him go. All right, 4 things. 4 things that this master does that gives us a clue on how do we go about doing this. So here's a couple things. Number 1 is the man was brought to him. The master brings this guy. And what I love about this is that oftentimes one of the erroneous teachings sometimes, or one of the erroneous things that we believe about forgiveness is that what Jesus is asking us to do when he's asking us to forgive is that we're supposed to excuse or condone or ignore when we're being abused or hurt. That one of the things that's often taught sometimes or believed is this doormat sort of theology of what forgiveness means. And some people think that what Jesus might be meaning is that, hey, if you're stuck in an abusive situation or if you're being hurt by someone, what Jesus is calling you to do is he just wants you just to forgive, and just keep taking it. Just to be a doormat, just keep taking it. And that is not what's happening in the passage, right? Because what happens in the passage? This guy owes this king a lot of money, and what happens? He's called to account. It is not allowed to continue. He is called on the carpet. He's called to account. The king doesn't allow it to continue. He says, what you've done needs to be addressed. Is Jesus asking us to ignore, condone, or excuse abuse or hurt? No, he's not. Does forgiving mean just passively taking it when someone keeps wronging you? No. What's the first thing we're supposed to do? Well, we're supposed to be proactive. We confront it. It shouldn't continue. We confront it. That's the first thing the king does, is he brings the guy in front. Here's the second thing he does, is the master took pity on him. The master took pity on him. This word pity is an interesting word because in other places in the Bible, in the New Testament, it's translated as compassion. It's the same word. It's the same Greek word. And I think probably compassion might have been a better word for this. But the point is the master sees this guy and he has compassion on him. How does he have compassion on him? He does something significant that I think is something that we don't do and that we need to do. Because what we often do when someone wounds me or when someone offends me or snubs me or hurts me, what I tend to do is I tend to focus on how different I am from that person. I focus on how different I am. Instead of focusing on our common humanity, I focus on how different. So if you lie to me, I say, oh my gosh, you dirty, rotten liar. I'm not a liar like that. You see what I just did? I don't lie like that. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, what do? You're like, oh my gosh, that idiot, that's a horrible driver. I'm a much better driver than that person, right? We distance ourselves from that person and we think about how different we are from them. And we kind of take a complex situation and a complex human and we boil them down not just to what they did to me, but who they are. They didn't just lie to me, they're a liar. You see what we do there? Not like me. I'm not a liar. They're a liar. But what we conveniently forget, and what we need to work on sometimes, is that, see, I also have lied. Have you ever lied? And if I were to ask you, have you ever lied? You'd say, well, it's complicated. You'd say, well, there's extenuating circumstances, right? Have you ever, I have a suspicion, you've probably cut someone off while driving, haven't you? Yes, you probably have. And so see, what we do when we're hurt is we distance ourselves from that person's humanity and we think about how different we are from them. But this master was able to have compassion. And the way that we're able to, in the middle, and I know it's complicated and I know forgiveness is such a hairy thing, but one of the first things that we can do is we can pause and instead of focusing on our differences, we can focus on our common humanity. That in a lot of ways, I am not very much different than that person. That in a situation perhaps that they were in, I might even do the same thing. And you know what that does? When we focus on our similarities instead of our differences, you know what that starts to do? I grow. I can grow in my compassion, just like this master did. Miroslav Volf, famous author, he says this in one of his books. He says, forgiveness flounders because first, I exclude the enemy from the community of humans, even as I exclude myself from the community of sinners. You see what he's saying? In other words, what I do is when somebody hurts me, I exclude them from the community of human. I dehumanize them in my mind. I create a caricature of them in my mind. And then at the same time, in the same stroke, what I do is I remove myself from the community of sinners. And now I've created this huge chasm, this huge gap between me and them. And in that situation, compassion, pity, humility cannot grow. It's the second thing that the master does. The next thing the master does really gets to the heart of what forgiveness is all about. The master, number 3, canceled the debt. Incredibly, canceled the debt. And this is where we get to the heart of it. Because when someone wounds me, when someone hurts me, someone wounds you, hurts you, we feel it as a debt. That's why we use the language, you owe me an apology. It's like debtor, owe language. When we get hurt, it's like something was taken from me. And so therefore, it's like I've got this open debt book. And now I know, okay, this person owes me. And so I'm just walking around with this debt that needs to be paid. Okay, this is how it feels for us. And so what are you supposed to do with that debt? What are we going to do? Because you've got 2 options of what to do with that debt. The first option is to make them pay. Make them pay for what they owe you. Now, in some situations, this might with little things, this might work out just fine, right? If Tough Harris came over to my house and broke my lamp at my house, you're a nice guy, and you'd probably say, hey, let me pay for that. And I'd say, all right, great. And then it would get paid for, all right? So we're not talking about that. If you take the route of, I'm gonna make them pay for what they did to me, here's what's gonna happen. You're going to walk around in life carrying this open debt, trying to get them paid. But could we just be really honest for a second? So many of the debts that we pick up in life, so many of the wounds and the hurts, some of the things that happened to you in your childhood, just the things that happen from day to day that we have to wrestle with, don't you know that those debts can't really be repaid? So many of them, they can't be repaid. For some of you, you've got a wound that you picked up in childhood, and it's deep and it hurts. And if that person that hurt you came back into your life today and said, I'm sorry, would that make it better? What if they came and said, hey, to make it right, I'm gonna stand out in the snow for 3 days barefoot and just make it right? Is that gonna make it right? No. What if they die? What if you just curse them and you hope that they die and then they die? Does that even make it better? No, it doesn't make it better. It doesn't fill that open debt. And so here's what you'll do is you'll walk around just hoping that debt is repaid, and it can't be repaid. And so here's what we do. This is what we all do. What we do is we take that open debt and we bring it into new seasons of life, and we lose sight of that original hurt. That's why from the book of Ephesians, it says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. And the reason why it says don't let the sun go down on your anger isn't just because you shouldn't go to bed angry. That's good advice. But what that means is don't take a wound that you incurred, an open debt that you incurred in one season of life, and carry it into a new season of life. Because what will happen is now you'll be in a new season of life, and you're angry, and you're bitter, and you think it's your wife. You think it's your kids. You think it's your boss. You think it's the government. You're pointing your fingers at everything. If they would just, then I wouldn't. And there's this bitterness and anger. And it's because you've got an open debt and you don't even know where you picked it up from. And it's turned you into a ghost. It's turned you into a wraith. It's twisted you up inside. You can't even make them pay. So why are we trying to do that? That's option one. Option two is we canceled the debt. But as you know, you can't just cancel a debt because someone's got to pay for it. The master canceled the debt, but he had to absorb it, didn't he? He had to eat that debt. So canceling a debt means you don't owe me, but even when I say you don't owe me anymore, I have to it's like I absorb it. It's like I take it. And you say, gosh, that's not fair. And I would say, it isn't fair. But you know what will happen in your heart if you build up the habit of canceling debts. Like here's what's gonna slowly and surely happen in your heart. You will become free. You'll become free. Do you know what will happen in your heart if you just keep trying to get everybody to pay that debt? It's gonna turn dark and ugly. The master cancels the debt. That's number three. And number four, what does the master do? The master let him go. Let him go. He dropped the right to demand payment. Now notice, it doesn't say that he trusts the guy anymore. Trust has been lost. It doesn't say that he rehires him onto his team, right? We don't know the details. But here's what we know. The master, he said, I'm giving up the right to demand payment. Meaning, when I see that guy in the market in a couple weeks, I'm going to have to tell my heart, I canceled that debt. 4 things. Did you pick them up? The man was called to account. The master had pity and compassion, and then he canceled the debt and then let him go. Those are the 4 things, and that's it. Just do your best. I'm rooting for you. Let's pray. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. No, right? Because there's got to be more, right? Those 4 things are great, but you don't have the power to do those 4 things. I don't have the power to do those 4 things. Where do we get the power to forgive? And the answer comes from this parable, because there's 2 keys from this parable that it will be impossible for us to have that kind of radical forgiveness if we don't understand. And we haven't even hit these keys yet. We're hitting them just right at the end. Here are these keys. Here's the key to the parable, is continuously grasp the size of your debt that you owe. And then number 2, humbly let Jesus' payment melt your heart. Those are the keys. That's the crux. Is first, we have to pause and grasp the size of my debt. And then next, I humbly let Jesus' payment of that debt melt my heart. You know, this first guy, he owed 10,000 bags of gold, right? It's so hard to translate. And when you're looking at Bible figures and to like modern day figures, it's so hard to figure out what that means. And I read a lot of commentaries on these verses and try to come up with a number. And really, there's no number. The best thing I've got is the debt that guy owed was about 200,000 years' wages. So just tally up what you would make if you worked your job in 200,000 years, and that would be the debt. I don't even know how you pick up a debt that big. That's a lot of trips to Vegas. You know what I mean? Like that guy, I don't know what was happening. But the point is this: it is an impossible debt. It's an unpayable debt. It's unpayable. See, sometimes we don't respond to God with gratitude and thanks is because we don't think our debt is that big. Band, will you come on out? And as they come out, I'm just going to close up our time. See, we don't respond to God sometimes in the appropriate way because we don't think our debt is that big. I've used this illustration before, but it's really the best illustration I have. But imagine someone comes over to your house and you're hanging out, and then you have to leave to go do an errand. And you leave, go do the errand, and you come back to your house, and the person says, "Oh, hey, a debt collector came to the door, but don't worry, I paid the debt." Okay, you got the scenario in your mind? They say, "Oh, don't worry about it, I paid the debt." See, the only way that you know how to respond is if you know how much the debt was. The only way you know how to respond appropriately is for you to find out how much the debt was for. Because if the debt was like a late library book, then what's the appropriate response for your buddy paying for a late library book? I'll tell you what the appropriate response is. It's like, "Sweet, bro. Thanks. That was awesome. I'll get you next time." That's the response. But what if your friend says, "Oh yeah, I paid the mortgage to your house"? What's the appropriate response then? I'll tell you, the appropriate response is you won't have words. You would be lost for words. You'd say, "Are you kidding me?" No, you didn't. You wouldn't even believe it. My suspicion is that we need to spend more time contemplating the debt that I owe. And then on the heels of that, this is Christianity 101, that Jesus came and he didn't demand payment. He came to win our hearts back. That he didn't ask us to pay because it's a debt that we can't pay. What he did is he put himself on the cross. And when he puts himself on the cross, he absorbs all of our sin, all of our debt, and it all comes on him. He eats it. He absorbs it. He takes it all on himself, and he lets it crush him for us. And then incredibly, 3 days later, he rises from the dead so that we can walk with a new power in a new kingdom in the ways of Jesus and not in the ways of Lamech. Gosh, the world needs a group of Christians who understand this reality so much, that we understand that we've been forgiven so much that now we can go and we can extend forgiveness to those that hurt us. What a powerful force. What a powerful testimony to the fact. That's gonna speak so much louder than the Jesus fish on your car. That's gonna speak so much louder than a billboard on the side of the road, is people actually taking this forgiveness in, letting it transform us, letting it change us from the inside out, and then we go and we extend that kind of forgiveness to the people in our lives. Wow, it would change the world. So here's how we're gonna respond today, is when you came in, hopefully you grabbed one of these. You might have thought that we forgot about these. We haven't. This is the perfect way, is for us to come to the table of communion and respond. So here's what I want you to do. this little meal represents, it's communion, it's the Lord's Supper, it's the Passover meal. There's this little cracker, it represents Jesus' body. And when we take it, we're supposed to be reminded that his body was broken for me. When we take the cup, we're supposed to be reminded that his blood was poured out. And so as we sing this next song and as we close, I want to invite you to lean into this parable. And I want you to hold the communion in your hand, and I just want you to contemplate the debt that you couldn't pay, the debt that's bigger than you can fathom. And then I want you to think about how incredibly it was paid for you. Therefore, you now are free. You don't have to pay. And then what I want you to ask yourself is, who then now do I need to forgive? What debts do I need to cancel?